organizer and an author and a farmer. And all of those things really intersect on the issue of climate change. I think as a farmer, a lot of people don't realize how much risk our food system is under because of the climate emergency. That if you want to be able to eat in the future, then you really need to address the problem of climate change. More generally, I've been an organizer for more than 20 years, and I've had some successful campaigns, but also a lot of campaigns that haven't made the progress that we need because of the urgency that we face, because of the scale of the crisis that we face. So I wrote the book Full Spectrum Resistance to really zero in on the lessons of movements of the past, to understand movements that have succeeded, that have won. How did they do what they did in practical terms? How did they recruit people? How did they organize them to be effective? What kinds of strategy and tactics did they use? And so this kind of tour that I've been on, which has gone from as far east as Cape Breton to as far west as Victoria and Haida Gwaii, has been both about sharing some of those lessons with other people and other groups, and also really tapping into what's going on right now in terms of the climate struggle, in terms of Indigenous struggles across the country, and what are the next steps that we need, what are the skills and capacities that we need to develop to really push things over the top, to achieve the wins that we need to achieve in the next 10 years. A lot of things have impressed me from other struggles that I've seen in the last year or so. Of course, Indigenous communities continue to be kind of the leaders in Canada in terms of resistance and in terms of direct action around the fossil fuel industry and extraction in general. And I think as for settlers like me, it's really crucial that we continue to recognize and celebrate and support those struggles in practical ways. Because those communities are often on the front lines. I've also been very excited about the emergence of larger scale youth activism. I think we're really seeing around the youth climate strikes and student-led activism a lot of progress that has been made in the last few months even. And it's really about taking that energy and momentum and applying some of the things that other movements have learned over a long period of time, right? Because that's one of the key differences in terms of the climate emergency versus something like the civil rights struggle or other kind of anti-colonial struggles. That in some of those struggles, maybe it takes, 2 or 3 or 4 generations to win. And we don't necessarily have that time, right, in terms of the climate emergency. So we really need to try to find some shortcuts and learn from those other successful movements so we can apply those lessons as fast as possible. I think Extinction Rebellion already understands a lot of the things that some movements take a really long time to learn. So I think that the emphasis on direct action and the importance of direct action is really critical, and I think that's something that is kind of baked into XR. I think the importance of kind of radical system change, that's also critical, because still a lot of the environmental movement is kind of focused on these individual lifestyle adjustments like flying less or recycling more, and those are fine to do, but they're not up to the scale of the problem. And then something that I think XR is doing that is really important that a lot of movements have failed to do is this idea of regenerative culture, is the idea of building communities that are worth being a part of, that are really welcoming and supportive communities that think about mental health and want to avoid burnout.
Where could we stand to learn from either movements that exist right now that are doing valuable work, or movements that have preceded us in history?
Yeah. I think there are a bunch of things that Extinction Rebellion can learn at this moment from other movements, and a lot of that in this context has to do with kind of transitioning from the UK to Canada, which is a very different situation in a lot of ways, and which gives us an opportunity to be reflective in terms of how we work and what our priorities are in general. So I think one of the key things to think more deeply about is the relationship with police. I think that the relationship with police in the UK has been very friendly in a way that does not translate very well to Canada. I think in Canada there has been there's been a lot of organizing, especially in Indigenous communities, but in other allied communities around missing and murdered Indigenous women and police violence. We've seen that as well, with Black Lives Matter, that there's a risk if Extinction Rebellion is too cooperative with the police, then it's seen as choosing sides, and ignoring kind of this legacy of profound police violence and racism. So it's really important to integrate that and that kind of decolonial way of thinking into how Extinction Rebellion engages with the police. And on a closely related note, I think the attitude about arrests, there's some potential for calibration that will help bring in more people. So sometimes I hear, oh, the purpose is just to get as many people arrested as possible, and that if you join XR, that means you're signing up to get arrested. But I think that places too much of a kind of universal emphasis just on the process of arrest. I think it's worth thinking carefully about what are the other roles that don't involve getting arrested, and realizing that it's not just kind of about the glory of going to jail. That movements that have succeeded in the past and elsewhere, it's really a small percentage of people in that movement who are on the front lines, whatever that means. And the majority of people are doing other stuff like communications or support or recruitment or training or logistics like feeding people and raising money. And those roles are really critical. And a lot of people don't want to get arrested either. Maybe they're people of color and their experience with police has not been as gentle as the experience of a lot of white middle class people, or maybe they have kids or a precarious job, or their immigration status is uncertain. There are lots of reasons that people want to participate in other ways. So I think looking for those roles, looking for those opportunities to allow people to participate fully with different levels of risk, and celebrating and recognizing the necessity for those roles is something really crucial that Extinction Rebellion can look more at. So I think it's worth being just a little bit more reflective about how movements now and in the past have generated disruption in a way that incorporates maybe the risk of arrest, but doesn't make arrest the goal. That disruption of the status quo is the goal. Some of the movements that I talk a lot about when I'm doing workshops for Extinction Rebellion are ACT UP, a group that developed to fight against the HIV/AIDS crisis in the late 1980s. I think their tactics and their situation are transferable in a lot of really important ways. I think looking at the civil rights movement is critical, but also looking beyond the top layer. I think there's a very kind of sanitized, mythologized version of how the civil rights movement worked, because it was not really about persuading those in power to change their minds. It was about causing disruption, about defending communities of color, and also about dividing the elites against each other. That's one of the things that helped the civil rights movement win, was that it split kind of state governments in the South and pitted them against federal government in a way that really weakened those in power and weakened racists. So that's something critical to think about, is how we can look at our movements and our campaigns as a chance to unify people in general, unify our allies, and unify communities of resistance, or at least bring them together at the same time as we divide those in power.
Yeah.
I think that the green bans in Australia, in Sydney, Australia, in the 1970s, are a great example of movements that use direct action in a really conscious way to build solidarity in an intersectional fashion, build solidarity against racism, against classism and gentrification, and against homophobia. I think that's a key example. I want to live in a world of fairness and equality for people and for the planet, right? So I want to live in a world where people do not fear extinction from ecological crisis, but also where people are not in a constant state of economic precarity, where people are constantly worried about making enough money for food and housing and medicine and all of these things. And I want to live in a world, likewise, where we've been able to confront and dismantle systems like patriarchy and racism and colonialism in a really meaningful way, and not just to get rid of people saying the wrong words, but to address those things structurally. And in Canada, that might look like rematriation of land to Indigenous people, but really to address systems of injustice in a fundamental way that makes not only a society worth living in for everyone and not just rich white people, but also a society that is not going to recreate the same kinds of crises that we face now, that is not going to recreate existential threats like runaway climate change, but also things like nuclear weapons and all of this other stuff. So a world worth living in, and a world that will protect future generations from having to go through these kinds of struggles and these challenges.
Awesome. Thank you so very much again.